Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. With us today, we have one of our country's preeminent, well, both practitioners and experts on the Middle East. His name is Dr. David Wurmser. I'm very proud to say he is a senior fellow director of our Middle East programs at the Center for Security Policy. He is a world class naval intelligence officer, former assistant to the vice president of the United States, the national security advisor, um, undersecretaries of state, and others. He is a formidable intellect as well as a great friend, and we're always delighted to have him. Dr. David Wurmser, welcome back to Securing America.
Thanks, Frank. It's really always an honor to be with you.
Thank you. Let me talk to you about a couple of things briefly because there's a lot to cover here and not a lot of time. The Middle East is a mess and becoming more so by the day. Of particular concern is my sense that we're sort of seeing a lot of people sort of pushing sparks into the tinderbox of the Palestinian Israeli conflict, as it's been called. I'm interested in your take on where that stands at the moment. And am I right that there seem to be a lot of people trying to, well, create, if not um, sort of out of whole cloth, certainly exacerbate um, the Palestinian ambitions for a new intifada against Israel?
Absolutely. In December 2016, just before President Trump took office and just after the elections, there was a vote in the United Nations that essentially declared the Temple Mount, Western Wall, really all of East Jerusalem, to be Palestinian territory occupied by Israel. It essentially recognized the Palestinian claim to the land and annulled the Jewish claim. And the United States abstained. And what that did is brought into question the whole Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. And ever since then, what you've seen is an escalating set of challenges to Israel's sovereignty over the Temple Mount.
And remind us very quickly, David, what the significance of the Temple Mount is.
The Temple Mount is holy to Christians and Jews primarily. Jews, because it is the holiest point in the world. It is where Mount Moriah is, where Abraham sacrificed or almost sacrificed Isaac. It is where the first and second temple of the Jewish people stood. It was the last stand of the Jewish people against the Romans in Jerusalem. So it is the epicenter of Jewish history. There's no doubt about it. The Christians, of course, because A, it is holy to the Jews, and Christianity is an extension of the history of the Jewish people,
Mm-hmm.
it is also holy to the Christians. It is perhaps not always the first in importance, whether it's the tomb, Holy Sepulchre, or whether it's the Vatican, but it is always up there, one and two, because it is incorporated into the theology and the symbolic uh, essence of what Christianity is.
Yeah,
It's
well,
important to the United States.
Jesus' time in the temple, among other things, right?
Yeah, and it's also important politically to the United States because we look at ourselves as the New Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, and number two, we based our concept of Washington being between the various colonies on the basis of King David's choosing of neutral territory between the tribes. So Jerusalem plays an important role for us, not
And
so much in Islam.
yeah, and for these reasons, the Muslim, uh, well, Sharia supremacists, I call them, have made it a focus of their efforts to seize and exercise control over both the Temple Mount itself and, as you say, one of the very holiest of sites, the Western Wall for the Jews.
They know that the West is anchored to Mount Moriah and Jerusalem symbolically as part of its core soul.
Mm.
And they know that denying that to the Christians and the Jews punches a fatal hole in Judaism and Christianity. So for them, it's the highest strategic target. And its importance to them is largely based on the annulling of Christian and Jewish rights there.
Right. So inciting the Palestinians to act violently on the Temple Mount itself would be a priority, obviously, for Hamas and for Mahmoud Abbas, the ostensible partner for peace, and Fatah, the president of the so called Palestinian Authority. Um, why would the United States government, though, be seemingly engaging in incitement as well? And how are they doing it?
Well, I think that there's a more traditional weakness on Jerusalem that emerges from the lack of understanding of history and appreciation of faith among American elites that simply say, ah, it's not that important, just give it to them. If it shuts them up, give it to them, essentially, is the
Mm.
American policy. So, in essence, it's to
But
give it to Muslims to quiet. But I think there's a more dangerous assault here underway because the key team members of Biden's administration that deal with the Middle East are progressives who have great hostility
right.
to the Western idea. So for them, they actually share to some extent the Sharia extremist view of Jerusalem. That
Mm.
if you take down that, you take down Western civilization.
Right.
It's essentially the equivalent of destroying the statues during
Mm.
the summer of 2020, or the 1619 project just physically manifest in
Yeah.
Jerusalem.
And solidarity with the radical
Yeah.
jihadists is something that the left has been doing. The red-green axis, we've called it for some time. Talk about the Kingdom of Jordan and what role it is playing with respect to this incitement and the violence that we've now seen on Temple Mount and the demands that Jordan is making to see it end.
Well, Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel, and Jordan has really almost as long as Israel existed had very tight, even secret at times, because before peace, strategic relations with Israel. But since 2017, you've seen a gradual distancing of Jordan from its cooperation with Israel and a switchover. Instead of working with Israel to manage the Palestinian problem, they have more and more become the advocate of Palestinian demands, and lately some of the most extreme Palestinian demands. So, in the last few crises, starting in 2017, but especially this round, Jordan crossed red lines. They called on and praised Arabs who were stoning and trying to hurt Jews, and Arabs who were cooperating with the Israeli army and serving in the Israeli army. So Jordan is acting now like a hostile power.
Not a partner for peace, after all. That has a couple of possible implications, David, as I understand it. One is obviously possibly further radicalizing the Palestinians, to be sure, but also possibly destabilizing the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Might that also be a knock on effect? And if so, what would the result likely be for, again, not just the Jordanians, but for Israel, perhaps Saudi Arabia, and others?
So I'm not a Hashemite or a Jordanian, so I can't say what's in their interests for real. But in essence, the history of it shows that whenever the Jordanian monarchy tries to appease Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism, it winds up in a fatal circumstance that needs foreign intervention to save it.
Mm.
The last really serious challenge was in 1970 that wound up in Black September. It's extreme violence where the Israeli army had to take actions to help the Jordanians the monarchs survive. That's the legacy of attempted appeasements. And the father of this king understood that and stopped after 1970 the periodic attempts to try to appease that, and understood that it
Among other
really
things, by encouraging the creation of a Palestinian state, right?
exactly. Now
Yeah.
this Oslo,
We're almost out of
the
time, David. I want to make sure that we don't cut this off because it seems to me it's of such importance to, well, our interests in the region as well as those of the King of Jordan and some of our friends, including Israel. So I want to come back to allow you to finish that thought when we get to the other side of this very short break. We'll be right back with more with David Wurmser right after this.